The QR code turned red. The woman behind the check-in counter froze, her eyes darting from the screen to my face and back again, like she was checking a photograph against a memory. My father was still laughing at his own joke, the one where he told me not to embarrass him. Then a 4-star general walked straight past 3 United States senators, past a room full of people who'd spent their whole careers trying to get noticed in Washington, and saluted me. My father's mouth was still open. He hadn't figured out yet that the joke was on him. I've stood in rooms with live gunfire close enough to feel the pressure change in my chest. I've briefed men with more stars on their shoulders than I could count men whose decisions moved battalions. But nothing in 20 years of service prepared me for how small I felt standing at the east gate of the White House next to my own father. It was a warm morning in early June, the kind where the humidity hasn't fully committed yet, but you can feel it waiting behind the breeze. My dress uniform was pressed sharp, my ribbons in order, nothing flashy. Nothing that would catch a stranger's eye unless they knew exactly what they were looking at. That was fine by me. I've never needed a uniform to announce me. It does that on its own to the people who know how to read it. My father, Richard Thompson, wore a navy suit he'd clearly bought for the occasion, the tag-fold creases still faintly visible at the sleeve. He kept adjusting his tie like it was choking him, glancing around at the security barriers and the black SUVs like a man checking to see if anyone important had noticed him yet. My mother was beside him in a pale blue dress, and my brother Michael trailed a step behind, phone already out, angling for a selfie with the White House fence in the background. "Don't embarrass me in there," my father said, not to anyone in particular, just out loud the way he always talked, like a general issuing an order to a room. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He said it the way you'd remind a kid not to run near the pool. Nobody laughed except him. But my mother smiled anyway, the kind of smile she'd perfected over 30 years of marriage to that man, the smile that meant, "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Michael snorted, half amused, half not really listening. I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that silence costs less than an argument you can't win, and with my father, you never won. You just decided how much of yourself you were willing to spend trying. We reached the security line. I handed over my invitation, a plain envelope with government letterhead that my father had glanced at earlier and assumed was some formality tied to his old golfing buddy, a retired colonel he liked to mention at dinner parties. He'd been telling people for 2 weeks that he had a connection getting the family into a ceremony at the White House. He never once asked what the ceremony was for. He never once asked why the invitation had my name on it, not his. The young woman at the check-in table scanned my QR code with the practiced boredom of someone who'd done this 100 times that morning already. Then her screen changed. It went red. She looked up at me, then down at the screen again, like she needed a second look to confirm what she was seeing wasn't a glitch. Her posture changed instantly, spine, straightening, the professional blankness in her face replaced by something closer to alertness. She glanced past me toward a cluster of officers standing near the entrance, and one of them a 4-star general with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons that told a story most people in that line would never be able to read, turned his head at exactly the same moment. "Sir," she said, her voice lower, now careful, "she's here." My father let out a short laugh, assuming there'd been some mistake, some mix-up with a name, and made a joke about government inefficiency that nobody around us found funny. My mother's hand found his arm, a small automatic gesture of reassurance she'd been giving him for decades. Michael lowered his phone, confused, glancing between the woman at the desk and the general now walking in our direction with a purpose that made the space around him clear itself. Aides and officers stepping back without being told to. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to see his face to know what was on it, that particular expression he wore whenever something happened, that he couldn't immediately explain, a flicker of doubt, quickly buried under the certainty that he was still the smartest man in any room he walked into. The general stopped a few feet away. He didn't look at my father. He didn't look at my mother or at Michael standing there with his phone forgotten in his hand. He looked directly at me, and something in his expression, respect, maybe even something quieter than that, told me this day was not going to go the way my father had imagined it. My father, for the first time in longer than I could remember, was quiet. He still believed it was a mistake. He still believed somewhere in that stubborn certainty he'd built his whole identity around, that whatever was happening had nothing to do with me. He was about to learn otherwise. To understand why that woman's voice shook when she said, "She's here," you have to go back further than that morning at the gate. You have to go back almost 30 years to a house in a quiet Ohio suburb where the furniture was always a little too nice for how tense the air usually was. My father built a modest fortune in commercial real estate, the kind of success that made him the loudest man at every dinner party, the kind of man who believed his opinion carried more weight simply because he'd earned enough money to have one. In that house, worth was measured in visible things: grades, trophies, the right college sweatshirt hanging in the right closet. And in our house, worth was measured most of all by whether you were my brother Michael. Michael went to a private school 40 minutes away, the kind with a Latin motto and a lacrosse team that made regional news. My father drove him there himself most mornings, using the commute as a chance to talk football business, whatever passed between them as bonding. I went to public school 2 blocks from our house, and I got there by walking because by the time I was old enough to notice the difference, I'd also learned not to ask why. When I told my father I wanted to apply to West Point, he laughed. Not cruelly, not right away, more like he thought I was joking. When he realized I wasn't, the laugh disappeared, replaced by something colder. "A woman doesn't belong in the military," he said, like he was stating a fact as obvious as the sky being blue. He said it at the dinner table in front of my mother, in front of Michael, like it wasn't even a controversial thing to say in his own home. I got the scholarship anyway. I filled out the applications myself, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, using a second-hand laptop with a cracked corner. I remember the acceptance letter arriving on a Tuesday. I remember reading it twice in the driveway before I even brought it inside, because some part of me needed a moment alone with it before my father found a way to make it smaller. He didn't come to my graduation. He told people he had a work conflict. I found out years later from my mother that he simply hadn't wanted to make the trip. "It's not a real career," he'd told her. "She'll figure that out eventually and come home." I didn't come home. Not really. Not in the way he meant it. For almost 2 decades, my visits home were rare, brief, and carefully rationed holidays, mostly sometimes not even those. My father knew in the vaguest possible sense that I was in the Army. That phrase covered everything for him. He never asked what I actually did. He never asked where I'd been stationed, what units I'd worked with, what my days looked like. Michael would ask sometimes out of what I think was genuine curiosity buried under years of following our father's lead. But even those conversations rarely went deep, because deep required trust, and trust required my father to treat what I did as something worth understanding. Nobody in my family knew the actual shape of my career. Not the training, not the deployments, not the years spent building operational programs that never made headlines, because the work that matters most rarely does. They knew the surface. "She's in the Army," said the way you'd mention a distant cousin's unremarkable job, something to move past quickly so the conversation could return to Michael's latest promotion or my father's latest deal. I stopped correcting the assumption a long time ago. There was no point explaining depth to someone who'd already decided the surface was all there was. So when the invitation arrived for that morning at the White House, my father assumed without asking a single question that it had come through his old friend from the country club, a retired colonel named Walt Bregman, who liked to tell stories about his glory days over cigars. My father told everyone at his office that Walt pulled some strings. He told the story so many times in the 2 weeks leading up to the ceremony that I think he'd started to believe a version of it that had nothing to do with me at all. He never once looked at the actual name printed on the invitation. He never once asked why it was addressed to me, why my rank and full name were listed in the formal government font at the top of the page, why the RSVP information routed through a communications office rather than through Walt's old email address. He simply assumed the way he'd always assumed that whatever mattered in a room, he was the reason for it. That morning, standing at the East Gate, watching that young woman's face change color faster than the sky before a storm, I understood something was about to happen that my father was not prepared for. I'd spent years learning to read a room the way you read terrain, looking for what shifts before anyone else notices it shifting. I saw it in the posture of the officers near the entrance. I saw it in the way conversations paused just slightly as people's eyes moved toward our small group at the checkpoint. A senior officer began walking toward us, his stride deliberate, unhurried, the kind of walk that belongs to a man who has never once had to explain himself to anyone in that courtyard. My father straightened his tie again, still smiling, still certain that whatever was about to happen belonged somehow to him. The officer who reached us first was a full colonel, A man in his 50s with the kind of bearing that comes only from decades of being the person other people look to for direction. He didn't glance at my father. He didn't glance at my mother or Michael. He walked straight to me, came to a stop with the crisp precision of a parade ground, and rendered a salute so clean it looked rehearsed, except it wasn't because nothing about that morning had been staged for effect. "Ma'am," he said, "it's an honor." I returned the salute, kept my face neutral, the way I'd trained myself to do in rooms far more chaotic than this one. Beside me, my father let out a short laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from a man trying to reassert control over a situation his instincts are telling him he no longer understands. "Guess they salute everybody who walks through that gate," he said loud enough for the people nearby to hear, like he needed witnesses to his own explanation. Nobody around us laughed with him. A few minutes later, a brigadier general approached, then a lieutenant general not long after that, each one making a point of crossing the courtyard specifically to speak with me, each one addressing me by my surname, with a formality that had nothing casual in it. They didn't call me Leah. They called me Colonel Thompson, and each time they said it, I watched something in my father's face tighten just slightly. The way a man's expression changes when he realizes the ground beneath him has shifted, and he wasn't consulted about it. Michael leaned toward me, his voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. "Who exactly are these people?" I didn't answer right away. I wasn't trying to be dramatic about it. I simply didn't know how to compress 20 years into a sentence that would fit inside a security line at the White House. So I said the only true thing I had time for. "People I've worked with." It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't meant to be. But it was more than my father had ever asked for in 2 decades, and the fact that Michael had asked it within minutes of watching a few salutes told me something about how differently my brother and my father were built, even if they'd been raised under the same roof with the same rules. I stayed calm through all of it. I didn't puff up, didn't perform for the growing awareness rippling through my family. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes from having spent your whole career being underestimated by people who mattered far less than you needed them to think they did. I'd built that quiet like armor, and it held now the same way it had held in briefing rooms and command posts far less polished than this courtyard. My father, though, was unraveling in small increments. I watched him try to recover his footing, straightening his jacket, clearing his throat, glancing toward my mother as if she might have some explanation he was missing. She didn't. She looked as lost as he did, though something in her expression was different, quieter, like she was beginning to understand something she'd suspected for years, but never let herself examine too closely. Then the courtyard changed. I felt it before I saw it, the particular shift in energy that happens when someone with real authority enters a space. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they softened attention, redirecting the way iron filings bend toward a magnet, even when no one's looking directly at it. Officers who'd been standing near the entrance straightened without being told to. A path opened through the crowd unconsciously, the way water parts around a stone. A 4-star general was walking toward us. I recognized him immediately, General Marcus Hale. I'd served under his command years earlier during a joint operations posting back when I was still building the reputation that had apparently followed me all the way to this courtyard without my ever asking it to. He'd changed little since I'd last seen him in person, still carried himself with that same unhurried authority, the kind that never needs to raise its voice because it's never had to. My father's face went pale in a way I'd never seen before. He recognized the rank insignia even if he didn't recognize the man, 4 stars meaning something even to a civilian who'd spent his life mistaking money for the only currency that mattered. I watched him swallow, watched his hand twitch slightly like he wanted to smooth his tie again but had lost the nerve. "That's..." Michael started but didn't finish the sentence. General Hale crossed the last few yards of the courtyard, and every officer near us stepped back, clearing space without needing an order the way people do around gravity. My father took an unconscious half-step backward himself, some old animal instinct recognizing hierarchy even before his mind had caught up to what was happening. I stood my ground, not out of arrogance, out of habit. You don't step back from your own commanding officer even years removed from active command, even in a courtyard outside the most famous building in the country. General Hale stopped in front of me. And then, in front of my father, my mother, my brother, and dozens of strangers who had no idea what they were witnessing, He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. General Hale held the salute a beat longer than protocol required, the kind of pause that isn't accidental, the kind a man allows when he wants everyone watching to understand exactly what they're seeing. Then he lowered his hand and extended it toward me instead. His grip firm, his eyes steady on mine, in a way that made the noise of the courtyard fall away for a second. "Colonel Thompson," he said, using my full title, letting it land in the open air where my father could hear every syllable of it. "It's been too long." "General Hale," I said. "It has." He didn't let go of my hand right away. He turned slightly, addressing not just me now but the small cluster of officers and aides who'd gathered at a respectful distance, and his voice carried the particular authority of a man who never needed to raise it to be heard. "Washington has been waiting for you," he said. "We don't often get the chance to properly thank the people who've spent this much of their career doing the work nobody sees. Today we do." My father made a small sound beside me, something between a cough and a word that never fully formed. I didn't look at him. I couldn't, not yet, not without losing the composure I'd need for whatever came next. But I felt the shift in him, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, a kind of internal collapse. He was trying very hard not to let show on his face. For 20 years my father had introduced me, when he introduced me at all, as "My daughter, she's in the army." The way you'd mention an appliance you didn't fully understand but assumed was functional. He had never once used a title. He'd never once asked what my title was. In that courtyard, hearing a 4-star general say, "Colonel Thompson," like it was a name that meant something, I watched my father experience for the first time in his adult life. The particular vertigo of realizing he'd been wrong about something fundamental for far too long to easily forgive himself for it. An aide approached with a quiet efficiency, murmuring something to General Hale before turning to me. "Ma'am, they're ready for you in the East Room. If you'll follow me." I nodded, and General Hale stepped back to let the aide guide me forward. My father found his voice at exactly that moment, stepping forward himself, his hand half raised like he might reach for my arm, the way he used to reach for Michael's shoulder in photographs. "I'm her father," he said to the aide, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard from him before, something almost pleading dressed up as authority. "We should be able to go with her." The aide's expression didn't change. It wasn't unkind, just professionally immovable, the practiced blankness of someone who deals with exactly this kind of request every day and has learned to answer it the same way every time. "I'm sorry, sir. Only invited principals beyond this point." My mother's hand found my father's arm again, that same automatic gesture, though this time it didn't seem to be reassuring him so much as holding him in place. Michael stood very still, watching all of it, with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between shock and the beginning of understanding. "Today, she's our guest." The aide added gently, the words landing with more weight than she probably intended. I turned to look at my father, then just once, just long enough to see his face fully. I'd expected anger. I'd built a version of him in my mind over decades that always responded to being challenged with anger, the same anger that had followed every disagreement at every dinner table of my childhood. But this wasn't anger. This was something closer to grief, the particular grief of watching a version of your life quietly close a door behind it while you're still standing on the wrong side. I didn't say anything to him. I wasn't ready to. 20 years of silence doesn't dissolve in a courtyard just because a general said your name correctly. I followed the aide toward the entrance. My mother and Michael and my father left, standing near the security checkpoint, waiting like guests at a party they hadn't realized they were peripheral to. I could feel my father's eyes on my back the entire walk, and for the first time in my life I understood what it must have felt like for him to stand somewhere and not be the most important person in the room. It was a feeling he'd built his whole identity around avoiding, and now, in the one place in America where identity is measured with the most precision, he had no choice but to sit inside it. The doors of the White House opened ahead of me, tall and pale and heavier looking than I'd expected, though I suppose every door looks heavier when you know what's waiting on the other side of it. I glanced back once before stepping through. Not for my father's benefit, not really, but because some old habit in me still wanted to see if he was watching. He was. Standing very still near the checkpoint, his jacket slightly crooked from where he'd adjusted it too many times, his face doing something I didn't have a name for yet. Beside him, my mother looked smaller than I remembered her looking in years, and Michael had his phone back in his pocket, no longer interested in photographs. I turned back toward the doors and walked through them into a room full of people who had spent years waiting to say thank you to a version of me my own family had never bothered to meet. The East Room was larger than any photograph had ever made it look, the ceiling high enough to swallow sound gold moldings, catching the light from 3 enormous chandeliers that must have hung there since long before any of us in that room had been born. Rows of chairs faced a small stage with a podium bearing the seal I'd seen 100 times on paperwork, but never once in person standing this close to it. I found my seat among a handful of other officers being recognized that day, and for a moment I let myself simply breathe, let myself feel the strange gravity of a room built to hold exactly this kind of weight. My father sat somewhere in the guest section several rows back, close enough that if I turned my head at the right angle, I could probably find his face in the crowd. I didn't turn. I kept my eyes forward, the same discipline that had carried me through briefings where the wrong flicker of expression could cost more than anyone in that ceremony would ever understand. The program began the way these things always do: a few opening remarks, an invocation, a color guard presenting the flag with the kind of practiced precision that never stops giving me chills no matter how many times I've watched it. Then the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium and began reading names, and mine came sooner than I expected. My photograph appeared on the large screen behind the stage, an official portrait taken years earlier, my expression carefully neutral in the way the Army teaches you to be neutral for exactly this kind of documentation. The announcer's voice carried through the room, listing not the kind of accomplishments that make headlines: no dramatic firefights, no cinematic rescue, but something quieter and in its own way harder to build. Years of leadership. Programs I'd helped design that shaped how entire units trained and prepared. Decisions made in rooms where nobody was watching, where the only reward was whether the people under my command came home safer, because of choices I'd made months before anyone needed to test them. The room stood. All of it at once, a wave of applause that felt less like celebration and more like acknowledgement, the specific kind of respect reserved for work that asks for nothing in return, except to be seen eventually by the people who understand what it cost. I didn't look at my father during the applause. I didn't need to. I could feel somehow the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. He was remembering, I think, all the calls he never picked up. The ones where I'd phone home during a rare stretch of leave, and he'd tell me he was in the middle of something, always something: a golf game, a client dinner, a meeting he swore couldn't wait. He was remembering the leave weekends I spent sitting alone in my childhood bedroom because he'd made other plans. Plans that never once considered rearranging themselves around the daughter who'd flown home on a 48-hour pass just to see faces that barely looked up from their own lives. He was remembering every promotion I'd earned that he never asked about, every certificate I'd mailed home that ended up in a drawer instead of on a wall, every quiet victory that passed through our family without leaving a mark on him, because he'd never once made room for it to. I stepped up to the podium when my turn came, adjusting the microphone with a steadiness I'd practiced in far worse circumstances than this. I didn't have prepared remarks, not really, just a few lines I'd turned over in my mind the night before, the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath it. I didn't mention my father. I want to be honest about that because there's a version of this story where the daughter uses the podium to settle a score, where the speech becomes a public reckoning aimed squarely at the man who doubted her. That wasn't what that moment was for. That wasn't who I wanted to be standing at that podium. Instead, I said something simpler, something that had taken me 20 years and rooms far less comfortable than this one to understand fully. Character is built quietly. I said, my voice carrying further than I expected in a room that size. Long before anyone applauds, long before anyone's watching at all, you learn who you are in the spaces nobody sees, and if you're patient enough and stubborn enough, eventually the truth of that finds its way into the light. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The room applauded again, warm and sustained, and I stepped back from the podium, feeling lighter than I had in longer than I could remember, like I'd set something down that I'd been carrying without fully realizing its weight. When I finally allowed myself to look toward the guest section, I found my father's face among the rows of strangers. He wasn't looking at the stage the way everyone else was. He was looking down, his head bowed slightly, his hands folded in his lap in a posture I'd never once seen from him in my entire life. Richard Thompson, The loudest man at every dinner party, the man who filled every silence with his own opinion whether anyone asked for it or not. Sitting perfectly still and perfectly quiet in a room where, for the first time, he understood exactly how small his voice actually was. My mother sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, though this time it didn't look like the automatic reassurance I'd watched her offer him for 30 years. It looked like something closer to comfort, the kind you offer someone who's finally arrived somewhere painful and true. I returned to my seat as the ceremony continued around me, the next name called, the next photograph appearing on the screen. But something in the room had shifted for me personally, some old weight finally settling into a shape I could recognize, and maybe eventually set down for good. 20 years of silence between my father and me had just been answered not by an argument, not by an accusation, but by the simple, undeniable fact of a life he'd never bothered to ask about, laid out in full view of a room he never expected to see it in. After the ceremony ended, the East Room dissolved into that particular kind of organized chaos that follows every formal event in Washington. Small clusters of people forming and reforming, handshakes exchanged in quick succession. Business cards passed with the practiced efficiency of people who understood exactly how short a window like this one actually was. I found myself surrounded almost immediately colleagues I hadn't seen in years, officers I'd trained alongside. Even an undersecretary I recognized from briefings I'd given a decade earlier, all of them wanting a moment, a handshake, a word of thanks for work, most of them only knew in outline. My father stood several yards away near the edge of the crowd in the particular kind of stillness that comes from a man who has spent his entire life being the center of every room and has just discovered all at once what it feels like to be furniture. Nobody approached him, nobody asked who he was. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Thompson was simply a stranger standing near something important, unrecognized, unnecessary. And I think that discovery cut him in a way no argument between us ever could have. I watched him from across the room while a colonel I'd served with in Germany told a story about a training exercise gone sideways, and I found myself unable to fully focus on the conversation. My attention kept drifting back to my father's face, to the particular expression he wore, something I'd never seen on him before. Not anger, not the wounded pride that usually followed any moment where he wasn't the one being admired. Something quieter, something that looked almost like grief. He understood, I think, standing there in that crowd, that my reputation in that room had nothing to do with him. It hadn't been built on his name, his money, his connections, the things he'd spent his whole life believing were the only currency that mattered. It had been built entirely without him, in rooms he'd never entered, through years he'd never asked about, by a version of his daughter he'd never once made an effort to actually know. I saw him start to move toward me, taking a few uncertain steps through the crowd, his hand half raised like he was trying to catch my attention, without drawing attention to himself, an unfamiliar posture for a man who'd spent his whole life doing the opposite. But before he reached me, an aide touched my elbow gently, letting me know the official photographer was ready for the formal portraits, and I had to excuse myself from the colonel's story, and follow her toward a smaller room set up with lighting equipment and a backdrop bearing the presidential seal. My father was left standing in the middle of the crowd, his hand still half raised, watching me walk away from him, for reasons that had nothing to do with him at all. I don't know how long he waited. Long enough, I think, for the crowd to thin, considerably long enough for the particular discomfort of standing alone in a room full of strangers to settle fully into his bones. It occurred to me later, once I'd had time to sit with everything that happened that day, that this must have been at least a small taste of what he'd put me through for 20 years. All those calls he didn't return, all those moments he chose golf, chose business dinners, chose anything at all over showing up for the daughter who kept reaching for him anyway. He was finally on the other side of that particular waiting, and I won't pretend I didn't feel something complicated watching it happen. Not satisfaction exactly, but something close to a long overdue kind of fairness. When the formal photographs finished, I stepped back out into the main room and found him waiting near the doorway alone, my mother and Michael having drifted off somewhere to find refreshments. He looked older standing there than he had that morning at the gate, the confidence that usually squared his shoulders noticeably absent, replaced by something more tentative. "I was wrong," he said. His voice was quiet, quieter than I'd heard it in my entire life. Not performed, not the kind of apology he offered when he wanted an argument to end quickly so he could move past it. Something real, something that had clearly cost him more to say than most sentences he'd spoken in 60 years. I didn't respond right away. 20 years doesn't unwind itself in a single sentence, no matter how sincerely it's offered, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just because the moment called for something cleaner, something more cinematic. I looked at him for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion in his face, the particular defeat of a man realizing very late exactly how much he'd missed. "I know," I said. "It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it wasn't nothing either. It was an acknowledgement, the first honest exchange we'd had in longer than either of us could probably calculate, and something in his shoulders eased slightly at hearing it, like he'd been holding his breath, waiting for a rejection that didn't come. He looked at me for another moment, and I could see him gathering the courage for something else, something harder than the apology he'd already managed. "Can we start over?" he asked. I didn't answer him right away. I let the question sit in the air between us, let him feel the weight of it, the way I'd felt the weight of his silence for 2 decades. Behind him, through the tall windows of the East Room, I could see the White House lawn stretching out toward the fence line, green and orderly, and entirely indifferent to the small quiet reckoning happening inside. I didn't answer my father's question that day, not with words, not right away. Some questions deserve more than an answer given in the middle of a crowded room still warm from the adrenaline of everything that had just happened. I told him I needed time. He nodded, and for the first time in my life he didn't push back, didn't argue, didn't try to talk his way past the boundary I'd set. He just nodded and let me go. A week later my mother called me, her voice carrying a kind of cautious hope I hadn't heard from her in years. She told me my father had taken the framed photograph from that ceremony, the one the White House photographer had sent afterward, official and formal me standing in uniform in front of the presidential seal, and hung it in the living room. Not in a hallway, not tucked in some back office where he could point to it when it suited him. In the living room, where every visitor to that house would see it first. She told me he'd started telling people about me. Not the version he used to tell, the vague, dismissive, "she's in the army," that covered 20 years of avoidance. A real version. "My daughter serves this country." He told his golf buddies, the same men he used to bore with stories about his real estate deals and Michael's lacrosse scholarship. For the first time in longer than I could remember, he wasn't leading with his own accomplishments. He was leading with mine. I want to be honest about something because this isn't the kind of story where forgiveness arrives all at once, wrapped up neatly like the ceremony itself. I didn't call him back right away. I didn't rush to repair 20 years of distance just because he'd finally said the right words in the right room. Healing, real healing, doesn't work like that. Not for me, not for anyone who's spent that long learning to survive without someone's approval. It happens slowly in small deposits, the way trust is always rebuilt one honest moment at a time. Over the following months, my father made those deposits. He called, and when I didn't pick up right away, he didn't complain about it the way he used to complain about everything that inconvenienced him. He simply tried again later. He asked questions, real questions about my work, about the years he'd missed, and he listened to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk about himself. It was strange watching a man in his 60s learn slowly and imperfectly how to be curious about someone else's life. Then came the day of my promotion ceremony, a smaller affair than the White House, held in a conference room at the base with folding chairs and a modest reception afterward, the kind of ceremony that never makes headlines and was never meant to. I hadn't sent my father a formal invitation. I hadn't needed to. Some part of me still wasn't sure he'd come, still wasn't sure this new version of him would hold up outside the gravity of a place like the White House, where everyone around him had forced a kind of humility onto him he might not choose for himself in ordinary circumstances. He came anyway. He arrived early before most of the other guests and sat in the front row without anyone assigning him a seat there. Nobody told him to. He simply chose it the way you choose to show up fully for something, instead of hovering near the edges, hedging your commitment in case it turns out to be less important than you hoped. When the ceremony ended, when the applause started the way it always does at these things, polite, brief, professional, my father was the first person on his feet. Not performing for anyone, not trying to be noticed, just standing, clapping, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I'd waited my entire adult life to see directed my way. I caught his eye across the room and I let myself smile just slightly, nothing dramatic, nothing that needed words attached to it. He didn't need a long apology from me. I didn't owe him one anyway. What passed between us in that moment was quieter than any speech either of us could have written, and somehow it said more than either of us had managed to say in 20 years of trying. Because in the end, this was never about the White House or the generals or the salutes that finally forced my father to see what had been true about me the entire time. The building didn't change who I was. It simply revealed who I had already become in rooms he never entered over years he never asked about. And for the first time in my life, my father finally saw me not as the daughter he'd underestimated for 2 decades, not as an afterthought standing in his son's shadow, but as the officer I had spent my whole life quietly working to become. Respect isn't something you're owed because of who your family is or what name you carry or how loud you can make your voice in a room. It's something you earn slowly in the spaces nobody's watching, and if you're patient enough, if you're honest enough with yourself along the way, eventually it finds you even in places you never expected it to. I still think about that morning at the East Gate sometimes, my father's voice telling me not to embarrass him. And I think about how far we both had to travel to arrive at something as simple and as hard-won as him standing up first to applaud me. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where it landed with you. Have you ever had a moment where someone finally saw the real you, the one you'd been quietly becoming all along? Tell me in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We share stories like this one every day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep walking through these stories together.